My name is Sarah, I'm 28 years old, and this is the story of how I gave my brother Jake the wedding of his dreams, only to find out I wasn't invited to witness it. Imagine spending $50,000 of your own money, your life savings, to make someone's special day perfect, and then being told you're not welcome at the very event you made possible. It's like building someone a house and then being locked out of it forever. The betrayal cuts so deep that even now, months later, I still wake up some nights wondering how someone I loved so much could treat me like a stranger. This isn't just about money, it's about family, trust, and what happens when the people closest to you show their true colors. Have you ever been betrayed by someone you'd do anything for? If this story hits close to home, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your support means everything to me, and I promise you're going to want to hear how this unfolds. I know there are others out there who felt this same crushing disappointment from family members. When we share these experiences, we realize we're not alone in feeling this kind of pain. Together, we can learn from each other's stories and find the strength to stand up for ourselves. Your engagement helps me reach more people who need to hear that it's okay to set boundaries, even with family. Picture this. You're sitting in your apartment, scrolling through social media, and you see your brother's engagement photos pop up on your feed. The happiness radiating from Jake and his fiancée Melissa was infectious. I found myself genuinely excited for them. Jake had always been the dreamer in our family, the one who talked about having this grand fairy tale wedding since we were kids. Melissa seemed perfect for him, with her bright smile and the way she made him laugh until his sides hurt. At that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. I was going to make sure my little brother got the wedding he'd always dreamed of. The next day, I called Jake and told him I wanted to contribute to their wedding fund. His voice cracked with emotion when I mentioned the amount, $50,000, which was practically my entire savings account. I had been planning to use that money for a down payment on my own house, but seeing my brother's joy felt more important than any mortgage payment. "Sarah, are you serious? That's incredible," he stammered, and I could hear Melissa squealing with excitement in the background. We spent hours on that call, talking about venues, flowers, photographers, and all the magical details that would make their day unforgettable. What I didn't know was that this generous gesture would become the beginning of the most painful chapter in our relationship. The money I gave with love and excitement would soon become a weapon used against me. Every dollar I contributed with pure intentions would eventually feel like a chain binding me to a situation I never saw coming. But in that moment, hearing my brother's gratitude and knowing I could make his dreams come true, I felt like the best sister in the world. Little did I know, that feeling wouldn't last very long. Growing up, Jake and I were inseparable. We were only 2 years apart, and our parents always said we were like two peas in a pod. When our parents divorced when I was 15 and Jake was 13, we became each other's safe haven. We promised each other that no matter what happened in our lives, no matter who came and went, we would always be there for each other. That promise shaped everything about how I saw family loyalty and what it meant to love someone unconditionally. I carried that promise in my heart for over a decade, and I truly believe Jake carried it in his too. After our parents' messy divorce, I naturally stepped into a protective role with Jake. I helped him with homework, drove him to soccer practice, and was his biggest cheerleader at every game. When he got his heart broken by his first girlfriend, I was the one who brought him ice cream and listened to him cry. When he struggled to figure out what to do after high school, I helped him research colleges and fill out applications. Being there for Jake wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. My identity was deeply tied to being the sister who would move mountains for her brother. The bond we shared made Jake's engagement feel like a celebration for both of us. I remember the day he introduced me to Melissa at our favorite coffee shop downtown. She was beautiful, confident, and seemed to genuinely adore my brother. I was immediately happy for him. "Sarah, this is the woman I'm going to marry," Jake announced with a grin that stretched from ear to ear. Melissa laughed and playfully hit his arm, saying, "Jake, we've only been dating for 8 months." But I could see in her eyes that she was just as smitten as he was. During that first meeting, Melissa asked me so many questions about Jake's childhood, his dreams, his fears. She seemed genuinely interested in understanding the man she loved. I found myself opening up to her, sharing funny stories about Jake's obsession with superhero movies and his terrible attempts at cooking. We laughed until our stomachs hurt, and I left that coffee shop thinking I had gained not just a sister-in-law, but a genuine friend. The three of us made plans to have regular dinners together, and I started imagining all the holidays and family gatherings we'd share in the future. But as I would soon discover, first impressions can be devastatingly misleading. The woman who seemed so interested in our family history and so grateful for my stories would soon want nothing more than to erase me from her new family picture. The laughter we shared that day would become a painful memory, a reminder of how wrong I was about who Melissa really was. Sometimes the people who seem the most welcoming are the ones who are already planning to shut the door on you. When you make a promise to family, especially during difficult times, it becomes more than just words. It becomes the foundation of who you are as a person. After our parents' divorce, Jake and I made a pact in our childhood bedroom, surrounded by his superhero posters and my collection of books, that we would always be there for each other no matter what happened. I was 14, he was 10, and we were both scared and confused about our family falling apart around us. We promised that unlike our parents, we would never abandon each other, never put other people before our sibling bond, and never let anyone come between us. That promise shaped every major decision I made for the next 14 years of my life. I need you to understand how deeply I believed in that childhood promise, because it explains why what happened next was so devastating. If you've ever had a sibling or someone you considered family make you a promise that you built your entire life around, please hit subscribe and like this video. I want to know there are others who understand the weight of family loyalty. Growing up, I turned down job opportunities in other cities because I didn't want to be too far from Jake when he needed me. I chose my college partly based on staying close to home so I could help him navigate high school after our parents basically checked out emotionally. Every relationship I had, I evaluated based on how my partner treated Jake and whether they understood that he was a package deal with me. The promise we made wasn't just about being physically present for each other. It was about being each other's primary emotional support system in a world that had already shown us how quickly love could disappear. When Jake struggled with depression during his junior year of high school, I was the one who researched therapists, drove him to appointments, and sat with him during his darkest moments when he didn't want to be alone. When I started my business and was working 18-hour days, Jake was my biggest cheerleader, bringing me coffee during late nights and celebrating every small milestone with genuine excitement. This reciprocal support system had worked perfectly for over a decade, and I never questioned that it would continue forever. But promises made in childhood sometimes get tested in ways we never anticipated when we were young and naive about how complicated life could become. When Melissa entered Jake's life, I initially saw her as an addition to our family unit, someone who would love and support Jake alongside me, rather than someone who would view me as competition or a threat. I remember telling my best friend Emma that I was so happy Jake had found someone who made him smile the way Melissa did, and I genuinely meant every word. The idea that loving Jake and supporting his happiness would somehow become a problem never even crossed my mind, because our promise had always been unbreakable. What I didn't understand at the time was that some people view close family relationships as obstacles to overcome rather than treasures to protect and nurture. The promise that had sustained Jake and me through our parents' divorce, through college stress, through career changes and heartbreaks, was about to be put to the ultimate test. I thought our bond was strong enough to withstand anything, but I was about to learn that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones most capable of breaking us completely. You won't believe what started happening once the wedding planning began in earnest, and it's going to shock you how quickly everything changed. Wedding planning has this magical way of making people believe that if they can just control every single detail, they can guarantee a perfect outcome for their entire future together. Jake and Melissa threw themselves into planning with an intensity I had never seen before, creating Pinterest boards, Excel spreadsheets, and color-coded calendars that mapped out every decision from the engagement party to the honeymoon. Watching them work together on their vision was initially heartwarming. They seemed like the perfect team, complementing each other's strengths and covering each other's weaknesses. The excitement was contagious, and I found myself getting swept up in their dreams of creating the most beautiful celebration of love anyone had ever seen. It felt like we were all working toward this common goal of making magic happen. Have you ever gotten so caught up in someone else's dream that you forgot to protect your own interests along the way? If you're enjoying this story and want to hear how this wedding planning nightmare unfolds, please subscribe and hit that like button. Your support helps me share these important lessons about family dynamics. I started attending every vendor meeting with them, taking notes, asking questions, and even using my business connections to get them better deals on everything from flowers to photography. My weekends became consumed with wedding tasks, from driving to 3 different bakeries to taste cakes to spending hours at bridal shops, while Melissa tried on dozens of dresses. I was so invested in their happiness that I didn't notice how my role was slowly shifting from beloved sister to unpaid wedding coordinator. The venue they chose was absolutely stunning, a historic mansion with manicured gardens, crystal chandeliers, and enough space for the 200-person guest list they had dreamed about since the engagement. When we toured the space together, Melissa practically glowed as she walked through the ballroom, pointing out where she wanted the band, the cake table, and the sweetheart table where she and Jake would sit during dinner. I remember feeling so proud that my financial contribution was making this fairy tale setting possible for them, and I even started imagining giving my maid of honor speech in that beautiful space. The venue coordinator, Mrs. Patterson, was impressed by their vision and kept commenting on how thoughtful and detailed their plans were becoming. But perfection is an illusion, especially when it comes to weddings, because you're trying to control not just logistics, but emotions, family dynamics, and the unpredictable nature of human relationships. The more detailed their plans became, the more I started noticing small comments that made me uncomfortable. Things like Melissa mentioning that some family members just wouldn't fit the aesthetic they were going for, or Jake agreeing that they needed to be selective about who would be in their photos. At first, I assumed they were talking about distant relatives or family friends they weren't close to, but there was something about the way they exchanged glances when these topics came up that made my stomach feel unsettled. The truth is, when people become obsessed with creating a perfect image, they sometimes start viewing the people in their lives as props rather than human beings with feelings and relationships that matter. Every decision became about how it would look in photos, how it would impress their guests, and whether it matched their carefully curated vision of sophisticated elegance. What I didn't realize was that I was slowly being evaluated not as Jake's beloved sister who had sacrificed to make their dream possible, but as someone who might or might not fit into their perfect picture. The castle of cards they were building was beautiful from the outside, but it was about to come crashing down in ways none of us saw coming. The journey of helping Jake plan his dream wedding started with pure love and excitement, but quickly evolved into something that consumed every aspect of my life for months. I threw myself into wedding planning with the same dedication I brought to building my business, treating every detail like a critical project that required my full attention and expertise. My calendar became packed with vendor appointments, venue visits, and endless phone calls with florists, caterers, and photographers who needed decisions made and deposits paid. I started keeping a wedding notebook where I tracked every expense, every timeline, and every conversation, because I wanted everything to be absolutely perfect for Jake and Melissa. This wasn't just about throwing a party. It was about giving my little brother the fairy tale beginning to his marriage that he had dreamed about since we were kids. But here's what happens when you pour your heart and soul into someone else's dream. You start to lose yourself in the process without even realizing it. If you've ever sacrificed so much for someone that you forgot to take care of your own needs, please hit subscribe and like this video because I want you to know you're not alone in this experience. My own life began taking a backseat to wedding planning duties, and I found myself turning down social invitations, working late into the night to accommodate vendor meetings, and spending my weekends driving all over the city to compare options for everything from linens to lighting. My friends started joking that I was more invested in Jake's wedding than he was, but I brushed off their comments because I thought they just didn't understand how important family loyalty was to me. The financial aspect of my contribution went far beyond the initial $50,000 I had promised to give them as a wedding gift. I found myself covering unexpected costs that kept popping up. An extra $1,000 here for upgraded flowers, $2,000 there for a better photographer, $500 for specialty linens that Melissa had fallen in love with. Every time Jake called me with another expense that was going to put them over budget, I couldn't bear the thought of him having to compromise on his vision, so I just said yes without hesitation. By the time we were 2 months out from the wedding, I had spent close to $70,000 when all the additional costs were added up, but seeing Jake's excitement made every penny feel worth it. My business started suffering because I was so distracted by wedding planning responsibilities, and I had to turn down several lucrative consulting contracts because I didn't have the mental bandwidth to focus on my own work. Emma, my best friend and business partner, started expressing concern about how consumed I had become with Jake's wedding, warning me that I was losing myself in someone else's life event. "Sarah, you're acting like you're the one getting married," she told me during one of our weekly coffee dates. And I laughed it off, telling her she didn't understand how special this was for our family. Looking back, Emma was trying to protect me from something she could see coming that I was completely blind to, because I was so deep in the wedding planning bubble. The most heartbreaking part of this journey was how much of myself I gave away thinking I was building something beautiful with my brother, when in reality I was just making it easier for him to eventually push me out. Every vendor meeting I attended, every check I wrote, every late-night phone call I took to solve some wedding crisis was creating a foundation for my own exclusion, and I had no idea. I thought I was being the best sister in the world, but what I was actually doing was funding my own heartbreak. The generosity that came from pure love was about to become the weapon used against me, and you're not going to believe how cruel the next part of this story becomes. The first crack in my perfect vision of Jake's wedding came during a routine vendor meeting at the florist's shop, and it was so subtle that I almost missed it completely. We were sitting around a table covered with flower samples, discussing centerpiece options, when the florist asked about the bridal party arrangements and specifically how many boutonnieres she needed to prepare for the groomsmen. Melissa and Jake exchanged a quick glance, the kind of look that passes between couples when they're sharing a secret, and Jake cleared his throat before saying they were still finalizing the wedding party details. I remember feeling a tiny flutter of confusion because we had talked about the wedding party months earlier, and I thought everything was settled. Jake had asked his best friend Marcus to be his best man, and Melissa had chosen her sister Katie and her college roommate Rebecca as her bridesmaids. What bothered me wasn't just the uncertainty about something that should have been decided months ago, but the way they seemed uncomfortable discussing it in front of me. The florist, Mrs. Chen, was patiently waiting for an answer so she could provide an accurate quote, and the awkward silence stretched on for what felt like forever. Melissa finally spoke up and said they would confirm the final count within a week, but her voice had this tight quality that hadn't been there during any of our previous vendor meetings. I tried to brush it off as wedding stress, but something in my gut told me there was more to this story than they were sharing with me. Later that evening, I casually brought up the wedding party conversation during a phone call with Jake, asking if he needed any help coordinating schedules or planning a bachelor party. His response was unusually vague, telling me that things were still up in the air, and that he and Melissa were working through some details about the overall wedding timeline. This was so unlike my normally decisive brother, who had opinions about everything from the color of napkins to the style of invitations. Jake had always been someone who made decisions quickly and stuck with them, so this sudden indecisiveness about something as basic as his wedding party felt completely out of character. The second red flag came the following week when I offered to take Melissa wedding dress shopping, something I had been looking forward to since the engagement. Sisters-in-law bonding over finding the perfect dress felt like such a special tradition, and I had even taken a day off work to make sure we could visit multiple bridal shops without rushing. But when I called to schedule our shopping trip, Melissa told me she had already found her dress during a spontaneous trip with her mom and sister the previous weekend. The way she delivered this news was casual, almost dismissive, like it was no big deal that she had excluded me from one of the most important wedding preparations. I tried to hide my disappointment, but I couldn't understand why she wouldn't have invited me to join them or at least mentioned her plans beforehand. That night, I called Emma and told her about both incidents, and she listened quietly before saying something that stuck with me for weeks afterward. "Sarah, I think you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that you might not be as central to this wedding as you think you are." At the time, her words felt impossible and even a little cruel, because how could I not be central to a wedding I was funding and had spent months helping to plan? But that tiny seed of doubt she planted started growing in the back of my mind, and I began paying closer attention to the subtle shifts in how Jake and Melissa communicated with me. You're not going to believe how much worse things were about to get. The first real confrontation with Melissa happened 3 weeks after the dress shopping incident, and it completely shattered my illusions about the kind of relationship we had been building. I had spent an entire Saturday morning researching photographers because Jake mentioned they weren't completely happy with their current choice, and I found this incredible photographer named David Chen, whose portfolio was absolutely stunning. When I called Jake to share my discovery, he seemed genuinely excited and asked me to set up a meeting for all three of us to review David's work together. But when I called Melissa to coordinate our schedules, her response was ice cold in a way I had never experienced from her before. She told me that she and Jake were perfectly capable of handling their own vendor selections, and that my help was becoming overwhelming and intrusive. I was so shocked by her tone that I actually asked her to repeat what she had said, because I couldn't believe those words had come out of her mouth. Have you ever had someone completely flip the script on you when you thought you were being helpful and supportive? If you're dealing with difficult family dynamics like this, please subscribe and hit that like button. I need to know there are others who understand how confusing and hurtful this kind of treatment can be. Melissa went on to explain that while she appreciated my financial contribution, she felt like I was trying to take over their wedding planning process and make it about myself rather than about their love story. The way she said financial contribution made it sound like I had just written a check and walked away, rather than spending months of my life helping them create their dream wedding. What made her words even more devastating was that Jake didn't defend me during this conversation. In fact, he seemed to agree with everything she was saying. When I asked to speak to him privately, thinking maybe Melissa was just having a stressful day and he would help smooth things over, he essentially repeated her complaints in slightly gentler language. He told me that while he was grateful for my help, maybe I was a little too invested in their wedding plans and should take a step back to let them handle things as a couple. I felt like I was being punished for caring too much about people I loved, and the unfairness of it made me feel sick to my stomach. The conversation ended with Melissa suggesting that going forward, they would handle all vendor communications directly and would only contact me if they needed additional financial support for something specific. She made it clear that my presence at vendor meetings was no longer welcome, and that they preferred to make decisions privately as a couple. I hung up the phone feeling like I had been demoted from beloved sister and wedding planning partner to just another checkbook, and the emotional whiplash was almost unbearable. How had months of collaborative planning and excited conversations suddenly become me being too involved in a wedding I was paying for? That evening, I sat in my apartment staring at the wedding notebook I had been keeping, filled with pages of notes, vendor contacts, timeline details, and budget calculations that represented hundreds of hours of work and emotional investment. Every page was a reminder of how much I had cared about making their day perfect, and now all of that effort was being characterized as intrusive and selfish. I realized that somewhere along the way, the relationship dynamics had shifted completely, and I was no longer seen as a partner in creating something beautiful, but as an obstacle to be managed. The wall that Melissa had built between us was about to get much higher, and what happened next would change everything forever. The systematic exclusion from Jake's wedding planning didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual process that started with small changes in communication patterns and escalated into something much more deliberate and cruel. After my confrontation with Melissa about being too involved, I tried to respect their wishes by stepping back from day-to-day planning details, but I still expected to be included in major decisions since I was funding the majority of their expenses. Instead, what happened was that Jake and Melissa started making important choices without consulting me at all, and I would only find out about changes through casual mentions in conversation or by accident when vendors would call me with questions. It felt like being slowly erased from something I had helped create, and the powerlessness was absolutely maddening. The first major decision they made without me involved changing the entire menu for the reception, switching from the elegant plated dinner we had all agreed on to a more casual buffet style that cost $3,000 less than our original plan. When I found out about this change during a phone call with the caterer who was confused about conflicting instructions, I called Jake immediately to ask what had happened. His explanation was that he and Melissa had decided they wanted something more relaxed and fun for their guests. But when I asked why they hadn't discussed this significant change with me first, he got defensive and said they didn't need my permission to make decisions about their own wedding. What hurt the most wasn't the menu change itself, but the realization that Jake no longer saw me as someone whose opinion mattered, despite the fact that I was paying for the food everyone would be eating. I had spent hours with them at the original tasting, discussing options and helping them choose dishes that would please all their guests, including accommodating dietary restrictions for several family members. Now, all of that collaborative planning was being dismissed as if my input had been meaningless, and Jake seemed genuinely confused about why I was upset about being left out of the decision-making process. The exclusion accelerated after that phone call, and suddenly I was being cut out of conversations about everything from the music playlist to the seating arrangements. Vendors started calling me less frequently because Jake and Melissa had clearly instructed them to communicate directly with the couple instead of including me in discussions. I went from being copied on every email about wedding details to hearing about major changes secondhand, and it felt like watching my own importance in their lives diminish in real time. The wedding I had been so excited about planning together was becoming something that was happening to me rather than with me. But the most painful part of this exclusion was that Jake seemed completely oblivious to how his behavior was affecting me, or maybe he just didn't care anymore. The brother who had once called me his best friend and biggest supporter was treating me like a distant relative who had offered to help with expenses, but wasn't really part of the inner circle. Every conversation became strained and formal, lacking the warmth and intimacy that had defined our relationship for decades. I kept hoping this was just temporary wedding stress and that once the ceremony was over, we would go back to being close. But deep down, I was starting to suspect that something fundamental had changed between us forever. Topic 9. A chamada surpreendente do planejador de casamento. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was in the middle of a client presentation, and it's a conversation I'll never forget as long as I live. My phone kept buzzing with calls from an unknown number, and I normally would have ignored it completely, but something made me excuse myself from the meeting to answer on the fourth attempt. The voice on the other end belonged to Rebecca Martinez, the wedding coordinator Jake and Melissa had hired to manage the day of logistics, and she sounded genuinely confused and uncomfortable about the reason for her call. She started by apologizing for bothering me and explaining that she had gotten my contact information from the vendor payment records, which immediately made my stomach drop because I knew this wasn't going to be a routine wedding planning conversation. Rebecca's next words hit me like a physical blow that I still feel in my chest whenever I think about that moment. If you've ever received news that completely turned your world upside down, please subscribe and hit that like button, because I need you to understand how devastating this betrayal really was. She told me that she had been instructed to remove my name from the guest list entirely, and that Jake and Melissa had made it clear I would not be attending the wedding ceremony or reception under any circumstances. The way she delivered this information was so gentle and apologetic that I could tell she was as shocked by this decision as I was, and she kept emphasizing that she was just following the couple's explicit instructions. I asked Rebecca to repeat what she had just told me because my brain couldn't process the words she was saying. How could I be removed from a guest list for a wedding I was paying for? How could my own brother exclude me from the most important day of his life after everything we had been through together? Rebecca confirmed that not only was I not invited to attend the ceremony, but that Jake and Melissa had also requested that all vendors be informed that I was no longer authorized to make decisions or changes regarding any aspect of the wedding. It was like being fired from a job I had never applied for, except this job was being Jake's sister and supporting his happiness. The conversation with Rebecca lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like my entire relationship with my brother was being summarized and dismissed in real time. She explained that the couple had cited family complications as the reason for my exclusion, but she couldn't provide any specific details about what those complications might be. When I asked if there was any possibility of a misunderstanding, or if maybe she should double-check with Jake directly, Rebecca told me she had already confirmed these instructions with both Jake and Melissa multiple times, because the request was so unusual. The finality in her voice made it clear that this wasn't a mistake or a miscommunication. It was a deliberate decision to cut me out completely. After I hung up with Rebecca, I sat in my car outside my office building for over an hour, trying to make sense of what had just happened to my life. The wedding that I had poured my heart, soul, and savings into was going to happen without me there to witness it, and my own brother had orchestrated this exclusion without even having the courage to tell me himself. The betrayal was so complete and unexpected that I felt like I was living in some kind of alternate reality, where everything I thought I knew about my family and my relationships was suddenly meaningless. You won't believe what I decided to do next, and it's going to change everything about how this story ends. The emotional aftermath of learning I had been excluded from Jake's wedding was unlike any pain I had ever experienced in my 28 years of life. Betrayal from a stranger or even a friend is devastating, but betrayal from the person you love most in the world cuts so deep that it changes something fundamental inside you forever. I spent that entire first night after Rebecca's call lying awake, replaying every conversation I'd had with Jake over the past few months, searching for clues that might explain how we had gotten to this point. The worst part was that there had been no major fight, no dramatic confrontation, no moment where I could point and say, that's when everything went wrong. It was just a slow, deliberate erasure of my importance in his life. What made the pain even more unbearable was the realization that while I was being systematically excluded, Jake was allowing me to continue funding his dream wedding without any intention of letting me share in the joy of the actual event. Have you ever felt used and discarded by someone you would have done anything for? If this story is hitting close to home, please subscribe and hit that like button. I need to know there are others who understand this kind of deep family betrayal. Every check I had written, every vendor meeting I had attended, every late-night phone call about wedding emergencies had been accepted with gratitude while Jake was planning to celebrate the biggest day of his life without me there to witness it. The betrayal felt even worse when I started thinking about all the sacrifices I had made for Jake throughout our entire relationship, not just during the wedding planning process. I had turned down job opportunities to stay close to him, spent countless hours supporting him through difficult times, and shaped major life decisions around being available when he needed me. Our parents had essentially abandoned us both after their divorce, and I had stepped into a parental role that I had never asked for but had embraced completely out of love. Now the person I had protected and supported for over a decade was treating me like I was some kind of threat to his happiness, rather than the sister who had made his dreams possible. The financial aspect of the betrayal added another layer of hurt that was almost impossible to process. I wasn't just losing my brother and missing his wedding. I was funding my own exclusion with money that represented years of hard work and careful saving. Every dollar I had contributed was essentially paying for Jake to celebrate his new life without me in it, and the irony was so cruel it felt like something out of a nightmare. I had given him my life savings thinking I was investing in our family's happiness, but what I had actually done was pay for the privilege of being erased from his life completely. But perhaps the most devastating part of this betrayal was the realization that Jake had allowed Melissa to orchestrate my exclusion without fighting for me or defending our relationship in any meaningful way. The brother who had once promised that no one would ever come between us had chosen his fiancé's comfort over basic human decency toward the person who had raised him. I kept waiting for Jake to call me, to explain what was happening, to tell me this was all a terrible mistake. But that call never came. The silence from someone I loved so deeply was more painful than any words could have been, and it told me everything I needed to know about how little our relationship meant to him anymore. After 3 days of crying, barely eating, and ignoring calls from concerned friends who could tell something was seriously wrong, I made a decision that would define the rest of this story. I realized that staying silent about this betrayal wasn't protecting anyone. It was just enabling Jake and Melissa to continue treating me like my feelings didn't matter, and my contributions were disposable. The old Sarah would have probably accepted this treatment, made excuses for Jake's behavior, and found a way to blame herself for somehow causing this situation. But sitting in my apartment, surrounded by wedding planning notebooks and receipts for thousands of dollars I had spent on a celebration I wasn't invited to attend, I felt something shift inside me that I had never experienced before. I decided that if Jake and Melissa wanted to exclude me from their wedding, they could do it without my financial support continuing to make their dream possible. The power I had been giving away freely out of love was about to become a tool for demanding the basic respect I deserved as a human being. I spent hours researching my legal options, contacting vendors to understand cancellation policies, and calculating exactly how much money I could recover if I chose to withdraw my support completely. This wasn't about revenge, it was about self-respect, and refusing to be treated like a disposable ATM by people who claimed to love me. The first step in my plan was to contact every vendor I had paid directly and inform them that I was revoking my financial authorization for any future expenses related to Jake and Melissa's wedding. The conversations were awkward because most of these vendors had worked with me for months and couldn't understand why the person funding the wedding wasn't invited to attend it. Mrs. Chen, the florist, was particularly shocked and kept asking if there had been some kind of misunderstanding, because in her 30 years of wedding planning, she had never encountered a situation where the primary financial contributor was excluded from the guest list. What I discovered during these vendor calls was that Jake and Melissa had been making expensive changes and additions to their original plans, assuming I would continue covering costs indefinitely regardless of how they treated me. They had upgraded the photography package, added a late-night snack service, and even arranged for a fireworks display that would cost an additional $8,000, all without consulting me or getting my approval for these extra expenses. The total amount of unauthorized charges they had committed me to was over $15,000 beyond what we had originally agreed upon, and every single vendor assumed I was aware of and approved these changes. By the end of that week, I had systematically withdrawn my financial support from every aspect of their wedding that hadn't already been fully paid for and delivered. I canceled the upgraded florals, the enhanced photography package, the premium bar service, and the fireworks display that Melissa had apparently been planning as a surprise for their guests. The venue still had their deposit and the basic package we had originally agreed upon, but every luxury addition that had been made assuming I would pay for it indefinitely was now their responsibility. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had some control over my own life and my own money, and it felt absolutely liberating. The confrontation I had been both dreading and desperately needing finally happened when Jake showed up at my apartment unannounced on a Friday evening, and his face was red with anger in a way I hadn't seen since we were teenagers fighting over borrowed clothes. He had obviously been drinking, which made the conversation even more volatile, and he immediately started yelling at me about ruining his wedding and being vindictive because I had withdrawn my financial support for the additional expenses he and Melissa had committed to without my knowledge. What struck me most about his anger was that he seemed genuinely shocked that there were consequences for excluding me from the wedding while expecting me to continue funding it, as if he had never considered that I might have feelings or boundaries about being treated so poorly. The fight that followed was the most brutal argument Jake and I had ever had in our entire relationship, and it revealed truths about both of us that we had never acknowledged before. Jake accused me of trying to control his wedding with my money, and claimed that I was manipulating him by withdrawing financial support when he couldn't afford to cover the additional expenses himself. I was absolutely stunned by his accusations because he was describing my withdrawal of funding as manipulation, while completely ignoring the fact that he had manipulated me for months by accepting my money while planning to exclude me from his wedding. The hypocrisy was so blatant that I couldn't believe he was saying these things with a straight face. But what hurt even more than Jake's accusations was watching him defend Melissa's treatment of me, as if it was completely reasonable and justified. When I asked him directly why he thought it was acceptable to exclude me from his wedding after everything I had done to support him, he told me that Melissa felt uncomfortable with how involved I was in their relationship, and that he had to prioritize his fiancé's feelings over mine. The way he said it made it sound like choosing between Melissa's comfort and my basic human dignity was an obvious choice, and he couldn't understand why I was making such a big deal out of not being invited to one event. The most devastating moment of the confrontation came when I asked Jake if he remembered the promise we had made to each other after our parents' divorce. And he looked at me with genuine confusion, as if he had no idea what I was talking about. When I reminded him of our childhood pact to never abandon each other the way our parents had abandoned us, he dismissed it as kid stuff that we had outgrown, and said it was unrealistic for me to expect him to base adult decisions on promises we had made when we were children. In that moment, I realized that the foundation of our entire relationship had meant nothing to him, and the person I had devoted my life to protecting had never valued our bond the way I had. The fight ended with Jake storming out of my apartment after telling me that if I couldn't be happy for him and Melissa without trying to control everything, then maybe it was better that I wasn't going to be at their wedding after all. His parting words were that I was acting like a spoiled child who couldn't handle not being the center of attention, and he hoped I would grow up and apologize to both him and Melissa before it was too late to repair our relationship. I stood at my window watching him drive away, knowing that the brother I had loved and protected for over a decade was essentially dead to me now, and the person who had just left my apartment was a stranger wearing his face. After Jake's explosive confrontation at my apartment, I spent the weekend in complete emotional turmoil. But by Monday morning, something had crystallized in my mind with perfect clarity. I realized that this situation had moved far beyond hurt feelings or wedding planning disagreements. It had become a fundamental question of whether I was willing to accept being treated as less than human by people who claimed to love me. The answer was absolutely not, and I decided to make one final attempt to salvage our relationship by offering Jake and Melissa a clear path forward that required them to acknowledge the harm they had caused. If you've ever had to demand basic respect from family members who took your love for granted, please subscribe and hit that like button. I want you to know that standing up for yourself is always the right choice, even when it's terrifying. I spent 2 days crafting a letter that laid out exactly what would need to happen for me to consider attending their wedding and maintaining any kind of relationship with them going forward. The terms were simple but non-negotiable. Jake and Melissa needed to publicly acknowledge that excluding me from the wedding while accepting my financial support was wrong. They needed to personally apologize for the pain they had caused me, and they needed to formally invite me to attend their wedding as an honored guest rather than a barely tolerated obligation. I wasn't asking them to change their entire wedding or make me the center of attention. I was simply demanding the basic courtesy and respect that any decent person would show to someone who had contributed so much to their happiness. The letter also addressed the financial aspect of their betrayal, and I made it clear that my continued support was contingent on being treated as a valued family member rather than just a source of funding. I explained that I had already withdrawn authorization for the additional expenses they had committed to without my approval, but that I was willing to honor my original $50,000 commitment if they could demonstrate that they valued our relationship enough to treat me with dignity. The choice was entirely theirs. They could have their dream wedding with my financial support and my presence, or they could exclude me and figure out how to pay for everything themselves. What I didn't expect was how empowering it felt to finally set clear boundaries and consequences for unacceptable behavior. For months, I had been accepting crumbs of attention and affection from Jake while giving him everything I had. But now I was demanding reciprocity and respect as the price of my continued involvement in his life. The letter took away their ability to take my love for granted while treating me poorly, because I was making it clear that my support came with conditions that required them to act like decent human beings. I hand-delivered the letter to Jake's apartment and told him he had 1 week to respond with a decision about whether he wanted me in his life or not. The ball was entirely in his court now, and whatever happened next would tell me everything I needed to know about what our relationship really meant to him. For the first time in months, I felt like I had some control over my own destiny instead of just being a victim of other people's selfishness and cruelty. The week that followed my ultimatum was simultaneously the longest and most peaceful 7 days I had experienced since this nightmare began. Jake didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up at my apartment. There was just complete silence that spoke louder than any words could have. On the 7th day, I received a brief email from him that was so cold and dismissive, it felt like it had been written by a stranger rather than someone I had loved my entire adult life. He wrote that he and Melissa had discussed my demands and decided they couldn't have someone at their wedding who was trying to manipulate and control their special day, and that they hoped someday I would understand that love means supporting people unconditionally without expecting anything in return. The irony of Jake lecturing me about unconditional love after excluding me from his wedding while keeping my money was so absurd that I actually laughed out loud when I read his email. His complete lack of self-awareness and inability to see how his own behavior contradicted everything he was saying to me confirmed that I had made the right decision in setting boundaries. The brother I had devoted my life to supporting didn't actually exist anymore, if he ever had, and the person who had replaced him was someone I didn't recognize or respect. But here's the thing about standing up for yourself in situations like this. Even when the outcome isn't what you hoped for, you gain something invaluable that no one can ever take away from you. I discovered that I was stronger than I had ever imagined possible, that I could survive the loss of the most important relationship in my life, and that my worth as a person wasn't dependent on how much I could give to others or how much abuse I was willing to tolerate in the name of love. The wedding happened without me. Jake got his fairy tale day, and I got something much more valuable: my self-respect and the knowledge that I would never again allow anyone to treat me as disposable. 6 months later, Jake reached out to me through our mutual friend Emma, apparently hoping to rebuild our relationship now that the wedding drama was behind us. But the person who had systematically excluded me, accepted my money under false pretenses, and then accused me of manipulation when I set boundaries, wasn't someone I was interested in having in my life anymore. I had learned that some relationships can't be repaired once certain lines are crossed, and that protecting yourself from people who have proven they don't value you isn't cruelty, it's wisdom. The most important lesson I learned from this experience is that real love requires respect, reciprocity, and basic human decency. Anything less than that is just emotional exploitation disguised as family loyalty. I'm happier now than I was when I was desperately trying to maintain a relationship with someone who saw me as useful rather than valuable, and I've built new friendships and romantic relationships with people who actually appreciate the love and support I have to offer. Sometimes losing the wrong people is the only way to make room for the right ones to enter your life. Now, I want to hear from you because I know I'm not the only person who has experienced this kind of family betrayal and financial manipulation. If you've ever felt used by someone you loved, excluded from important events after contributing to them, or struggled with setting boundaries with family members who took your generosity for granted, please share your story in the comments below. If this video helped you feel less alone in your own difficult family situation, make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit that like button. Your support means everything to me and helps me reach other people who need to hear these stories. I read every single comment, and I want you to know that your experiences matter and your feelings are valid, even when the people who hurt you try to convince you otherwise. What would you have done in my situation? Do you think I was right to withdraw my financial support when I was excluded from the wedding? Or should I have continued funding Jake's dreams regardless of how he treated me? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective because these situations are never black and white, and sometimes it helps to hear how other people would handle similar circumstances. Have you ever had to choose between maintaining a relationship and maintaining your self-respect? How did you navigate that impossible decision? And what did you learn from the experience? If you're currently dealing with a family member who is taking advantage of your generosity or treating you poorly while expecting your continued support, I want you to know that you have more power than you think you do. Setting boundaries isn't cruel or manipulative. It's necessary for your own mental health and emotional well-being. You don't owe anyone unlimited access to your resources, your time, or your emotional energy, especially if they're not treating you with the respect and consideration you deserve as a human being. Please subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to see more videos about family dynamics, setting healthy boundaries, and recovering from toxic relationships. Next week, I'm going to share the story of how I rebuilt my life after cutting contact with Jake, including the new relationships I've formed and the lessons I've learned about recognizing red flags before they become major problems. I'll also talk about the legal steps I took to protect myself financially and how you can do the same if you're supporting family members who might be taking advantage of your kindness. Remember that your worth isn't determined by how much you can give to others or how much dysfunction you're willing to tolerate in the name of family loyalty. You deserve to be treated with kindness, respect, and consideration by everyone in your life, and anyone who can't meet that basic standard doesn't deserve access to the love and support you have to offer. Thank you for watching, thank you for sharing your own stories, and I'll see you in the next video where we'll talk about how to build the healthy, reciprocal relationships you actually deserve.